Welcome, everyone. I am Bob Wurzelbacher, the director of the Respect Life Office for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, and this is our video podcast series that we call Being Pro-Life. Each month, we discuss a different topic in the Respect Life arena. We'll hear a personal story of someone deeply affected by that issue, and finally, we'll share ways that you can get involved. Today's guest is Terri Marcroft, founder of Unplanned Good, a nonprofit organization that promotes adoption as a viable, reasonable option for those dealing with unplanned pregnancies. Terri, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Bob. I'm thrilled to be with you.
So, Terri, your story begins with a personal story of becoming an adoptive parent yourself. Can you tell us a little bit about that journey?
Absolutely. My husband and I had been trying to start our family for several years when we finally turned to adoption. And once we did that and connected with an adoption agency, it took maybe a year or a year and a half to get connected with the birth mother who had chosen us. And in hindsight now, I can tell you that our adoption journey was so blessed and so beautiful and so really seamless. It all went very smoothly. And we didn't even realize at the time how grateful we were supposed to be for that, because we were definitely blessed with a beautiful adoption. But it was about 10 years after our daughter was placed with us that my friends started asking me, how did you do that? How did you get a successful adoption going? Because my friends were facing infertility and they weren't able to adopt because there are so few babies available to adopt. So that made me wonder about what was happening with all those pregnancies that you see every day. Young women are pregnant everywhere you look. And I was just wondering, if there's so many women facing unplanned pregnancy, why are there so few babies available for adoption? That didn't make sense. And so when I found out that it's less than 1% of the women facing unplanned pregnancy who choose adoption, I thought something needs to change there. Somebody needs to know how beautiful adoption can be, and maybe more women will choose it.
So less than 1%, that is an astounding number. Do you know what that is in numbers itself and not just as a percentage?
Yes, it's just under 20,000 a year now.
About 20,000 adoptions per year in the United
18,
States.
19, 17,000, something like that.
Meaning there's about 2 million unplanned pregnancies.
About 2.8 million unplanned pregnancies in this country every year. So 1 in 4 teens will be pregnant before 20 years old.
Wow. Now, how does that compare to the rest of the world?
We lead. We lead in unplanned pregnancies. We lead in abortions. We lead in single mother homes. We lead in infertility. We lead in low birth rates. We lead in lots of ways that are leading to this crisis.
So we lead in abortions. You probably mean in the industrial world, in the Western nations, we lead in abortion rate? Or
yes.
Wow. So we don't have enough people considering adoption. Did you want to share more about your story?
Well, so we've had an open adoption, because open is really a continuum. There are a lot of possibilities on the continuum of open adoption. But when we left the hospital, my husband and I were able to see our daughter born because we walked the last 4 or 5 months of our birth mother's pregnancy along with her. And when she went into labor, we were called and we were able to go to the hospital in time to see our daughter born and to spend some time with our birth mother. And as we were all leaving the hospital, our birth mother said to me, just promise to send pictures at least every other month. And so we did that for years when we didn't actually hear too much from her for the next 5 years after my daughter Sydney was born. And so in those 5 years, it was very quiet, and I just sent the pictures bi-monthly. And then when Sydney was in kindergarten was when our birth mother first contacted us again and said, hey, my life is changing. She said, I finished college, started grad school, but then we invaded Iraq. And so she said she had decided that she was going to join the military and request to be stationed in Iraq. And in case she didn't come back, she wanted to have spent some time with Sydney.
Oh my goodness.
So from that time on, we were much more in touch, and she wrote us letters and we had visits. And that was really a turning point when she joined the military.
Explain to our audience, first of all, the difference between closed and open adoption, and then maybe some of those fears of why do people, they hear the term open adoption and there's like, oh, that sounds scary. Like, I don't want more parents, that child to be sharing parents or something like that.
Right. There is a lot of confusion around the term open adoption. Part of that is because it's relatively new. So prior to the year 2000, so if you look at the 70s and the 80s and some of the 90s, closed adoptions were the standard in the United States. And a closed adoption meant that often the pregnant woman was not even the one who chose to place the baby for adoption. Often it was under the pressure of her parents. And she was often sent away to another relative, maybe another state, and told to come back after delivering and placing that baby for adoption, and then never talk about it again.
Right.
Just forget about it. And that whole scenario of how adoption was practiced in the 1900s was very unhealthy and harmful. It was emotionally traumatic for that woman because
Right.
there was no information. She didn't know what happened after placing that baby. And so around the year 2000, give or take, 5 years or so, we changed our practices completely so that now we have more open adoption, which I like to think of as a continuum, because on the lesser open side of the continuum, it could mean just that you have a phone number and a name, and maybe you get a Christmas card.
Right.
And on the far end of the continuum, an open adoption could mean you talk to each other, you're connected on social media, you share
Right.
holidays, there's everything in between. So the essence of openness really is just that the possibility is there, the possibility for a loving relationship in your life. And if you choose to be close, you can be close. But like any relationship in your life, you make what you want it to be. You define your terms, you set your boundaries. With anybody in your life, you have to do that. And it's the same in an open adoption.
Right. So this typically involves literally a conversation between a pregnant woman and the potential adoptive couple on what are your plans for the future, and what kind of contact do you want, and have some kind of agreement.
Right. You could lay all that out ahead of time and compare ideas as best you know them at the time. But then all of that changes as we go through life and things evolve, and what worked 5 years ago might not work today. So it's really a spirit of openness also means being flexible and changing things according to what's appropriate at the time.
Right. I can imagine, I don't even imagine, I know couples who are looking to adopt who have an initial fear of open adoption. They have a fear that, well, I don't want this adoptive mother to start demanding lots of time all of a sudden of this child that I'm trying to raise. Is this an unfounded concern if you're interested in adopting?
I would say it's an understandable concern,
Sure.
but it's a fear-based concern. And so when you dispel that fear with facts, the truth is that any kind of relationship requires the agreement of both people. People don't show up at your house if you haven't invited them, right?
Right.
And so it's really to be mutually decided and discussed. But the thing to remember is that when a woman places her baby for adoption, she has already overcome so many obstacles and gone through so many second guessing of her decisions and filled out so much paperwork. She's pretty convicted of why she's doing that and the fact that it's most likely the best thing for her baby. That's why she's choosing adoption in the first place, because she doesn't feel equipped to parent, but yet she wants the best upbringing for her child. And so, with that being the foundational emotion for the birth mother, it's very unlikely that she's going to come back later and say, oh, we're going to throw that whole agreement out the window or change her mind drastically. Most of the time, the birth mothers who are involved in open adoptions are just pleased and happy to be informed about the current situation and to know how their child is doing. That's really all they want for the most part. They want that reassurance that the child is happy and healthy and thriving. And if they can share time once in a while, that's great too.
And I, by far, mostly hear these positive stories as well. But
Mhm.
for the prospective adopted couple, I think it's fair to say that if, and it does happen perhaps at times, if it does happen, there ends up being some kind of difficulty with how much they want to see the birth parent, the adoptive couple actually has the legal standing to determine those terms.
They do. They are the parents.
Right.
They are the legal guardians, the legal parents. And so they make all of those decisions. But from the adoptive parent standpoint, the
Right.
reason why they would be interested in including the birth mother in their lives, even just a little bit, is because that means the entire three-sided relationship between the birth mothers, the adoptive parents, and the child is steeped in transparency and honesty and free flow of information. And that's a very healthy thing, especially for children to grow up with. Because if a child understands that the adoption plan was made out of an intense love, the child gets answers along the way. The adoptive parents get information along the way that might be helpful in a whole bunch of different scenarios. But it's really proven to be healthier for everybody involved. And that's why the adoptive parents often now are welcoming this involvement from the birth mother.
Right. It's a positive experience for the child, right?
Yes.
In addition
Yes.
to the family and obviously the birth mother as well, wanting to know what has happened to their
Yes.
child. I do
Yeah.
know women who have placed their children for adoption decades ago in the closed adoption era. And it's a real hole in their heart, not having any idea what is happening to their child. It can be very difficult.
Yes. Hole in their heart.
So
That's a good way to say it, because there is some grief involved there in placing your child, of course.
back to that 1%, right? Why is it you think that people aren't considering adoption these days?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of reasons that are feeding into that lack of consideration for adoption. To start with, the young women that we're talking about, they might be in their teens, they might be in their 20s, but empathy for others is our last emotion that develops as we mature. And so if they're just centering on what's best for themselves, and society is telling them that the abortion is quick and easy and harmless and without negative consequences, and they believe that, and they don't have someone else in their life that's speaking into their decision-making process here, then it's easy to see why a young woman would just drive down to the abortion facility on the weekend, because they've bought that whole story that it's without consequences
Right.
and it's a quick and easy solution. When in fact, there's so much harm that's done to a woman's body and a woman's mental health through even one abortion, not to mention successive abortions. But so our society is really on the side of pressuring them for that quick and easy solution. And then also, when our society and our churches specifically are judgmental about the woman facing unplanned pregnancy, if we're going to judge her, that also pushes her towards the abortion solution.
Right.
So all these women that are facing unplanned pregnancy, the 1 in 4 teenagers who face it before 20 years old, if we were to embrace them and not focus on the past, but just say, okay, that's the situation today. Let's figure out from here forward, what are we going to do? What are the considerations to think about and talk about and figure out the best solution in the big picture? Because that's another very mature emotion, is to be able to look at the big picture, not just this week, but to look at the big picture of your future, your baby's future, your mental and physical health. All of that is big picture thinking. And that's why adults are needed to speak into the situation and encourage the young woman to look into adoption.
Terri, I have an interesting question here now. So, if a woman is facing an unplanned pregnancy, she either is going to want to hide the fact that this has happened from the world, and abortion is the way to do that, right? You never have to show that you're pregnant, or you go the model of trying to be that, in many ways, heroically looked at single mom, right? And of course, any woman who is a single mom, that they're being heroic and they're doing the best they can, but there is the reality that statistically, children in single parent homes versus children in families with both the mom and dad together, you're climbing an uphill battle when you're in
Absolutely.
a single parent home. I mean, there's the reality, and absentee fathers are a big problem in this society. But society does not talk about the beauty of adoptions. So this idea that the culture recognizes the heroism of a mother in an unplanned pregnancy, carrying that child to term and placing that child with a loving couple, that you just don't hear about that or see about that. What do you think society can do to change that absent model, right? That we don't seem to have.
Yeah, that's definitely an issue of education and information. In December, I gave a keynote speech to Idaho Chooses Life, which is the main pro-life group here in Idaho. And it was almost 600 people in a room, and we talked about the birth mother as the heroine of the story,
Right.
that she's the one who made all the difficult decision and overcame all the really tremendous obstacles in order to place her baby in a good family and to protect her own health, of course. And the feedback, all those people were just so shocked. And these were pro-life people, so shocked to think about adoption as a pro-life solution. Instead of just saying no to abortion, they could actually encourage people to say yes to adoption. And that was a whole new frame of mind, a whole new set of thinking. And so that led to a whole bunch of work we're doing in Idaho now to pass legislation to care for the birth mother and increase information and education about adoption in the schools. And so that's all been very exciting. But yeah, that's what it is. It's changing people's mindset and the information they have about adoption.
So when a birth mother places a child for adoption, does the agency typically have ongoing emotional support for that birth mother after the placement of that child? Or is that pretty much left to the relationship they have with the family they placed with?
Yes. Either with a closed adoption or an open adoption, the agency is in a position to recommend counseling. And some states even mandate that there will be pre-placement and post-placement counseling for that birth mother. And in the adoption community, we are very much in favor of making sure that the woman knows that she's entitled to counseling, because it's important to have that therapy and that emotional assistance, because it's not an easy thing to do. Even as ideal as our situation was, I mean, still the birth mother needs some help. Like you're getting over any kind of loss in your life. Having some therapy or counseling is extremely helpful to just help you in advance make sure that this is what you want to do and make sure that you understand what you're getting into and what the arrangement is going to look like. And then also after placement to help with that grieving and healing process. It's very important. And all birth mothers are entitled to that.
Right, exactly. So hopefully we can say that gone are those days when the birth mother would be sent off. I mean, it's literally what would happen. They would be sent off so that the neighborhood and the school never knew that they were pregnant in the first place. I'm using the language that we use today. They would place their baby for adoption, but you would hear then the terms give up the baby for, give up the baby, the term you would hear.
Right.
Is a phrase you would hear, and then they would never hear about it again. That was just
Right.
emotionally damaging.
It is. And even that term, giving up
Right.
your baby for adoption, I try to encourage people to replace that phrase with placing your baby for adoption or making an adoption plan, because in the spirit of open adoption, they're not actually giving up that baby. They're placing them in a different home with different parents, but they can stay connected. So there's not giving up that necessarily has to be a part of it.
Right, exactly. Let's address something quickly, perhaps. There might be some people listening to this, right? Could be a little bit even confused about adoption, because I was giving a presentation recently at a high school about abortion and about teen pregnancy. And somebody raised their hand and asked a question. They said, well, you're talking about placing a child into a system that is so broken, it doesn't have enough families who are trying to adopt, and how difficult of a life that is for the child. Clearly, they were confusing or conflating the foster care system from infant adoption. So setting aside the solution to the broken foster care system would not be, of course, be to kill the children, but setting that aside, we are talking about different things. So maybe if there's anybody still uncertain what infant adoption is and about the availability of that versus what the foster care system is.
Right. And so those are two completely different things. And the biggest difference is in the situation of the birth mother for that baby, because in the foster situation, the Child Protective Services came in and took the children or the child. She's lost her rights because of something that she did, some kind of breaking the law or whatever circumstance caused her to lose her children. Whereas in infant adoption, the birth mother has not lost her rights for cause. She has actually made a proactive decision to give her baby a better life and a better upbringing than she can provide herself. So that's the big difference between those two situations.
Right. And then the availability. We touched on this in the beginning, but the availability of couples to adopt infants at birth there's way more couples than there are babies available.
Right. Way more. We think that there are approximating almost 2 million couples in the country at any given time who are waiting and hoping to adopt an infant, whereas there are less than 20,000 available each year.
Right. Whereas those numbers are probably approximately flipped in the foster care system. The number of children that need homes to be placed in after having been taken away from their biological parent for whatever reason. But in many cases, the goal is to reunite the family. So the foster family is just taking in and caring and loving the child for a certain period of time. In some cases, until it is that they're reunited again with their biological family.
You're right. The ultimate goal of the foster system, as you just said, is the reunification of the child with bio parents. But
Whereas infant adoption, that's permanent from day one.
yes.
What about the idea of adopting several children and then having to maintain several birth family separate relationships with each one of your children? You know, families who have several birth families with several children and how difficult or not difficult it is to deal with that kind of a situation?
When you have adopted several children and you're experiencing open adoptions with 3 or 4 different birth mothers,
Right.
that might seem complicated at first glance, but then there are a lot of extended families that we can think of. You know, there are a lot of people with 29, 30 first cousins. There are people who have very large families. And of course, families do get a little messy and a little complex. But I believe that we all have room in our hearts to love more people and bring them into our circles and bring them close to us as part of our family. And actually, the man that I collaborated with on my second book, Tim Elder, has 3 adopted children with 3 different birth mothers, and they have open adoptions. And for him, it's all about the blessing of adoption. So I've never heard him complain about juggling these different birth mothers in all the conversations that we've had while writing this second book.
A lot of part of what I do is work with pregnancy care centers who are working with moms who are in crisis pregnancies, right? Many of them are considering abortion, and we're working with them on what are the resources available for you to either raise this child or place this child for adoption. But certainly the statistics bear out, similar to what you were saying, was that it's not very common for a woman in that situation or who goes to a pregnancy care center to choose adoption. Do you have advice for pregnancy care centers on how to better work with the option and encouraging mothers to consider that?
So the pregnancy care centers are often Christian organizations.
Right.
And so if we want to assume that we're talking about Christian pregnancy centers and clinics, the first piece of advice I would give them is just to remember how adoption is biblical. I mean, starting with Pharaoh's daughter and Moses being placed in the river,
That's right.
starting with that and going up through Joseph adopting Jesus, and finally God adopting all of us into the kingdom through the work that Christ did on the cross. It's biblical. And so when we're suggesting adoption, we can have that confidence that we're speaking God's will for his kingdom. And if we look at it from that standpoint, it might give us more confidence to have the conversation, because I think the lack of confidence is the biggest problem that pregnancy care centers have in not being more forthcoming about suggesting adoption. It seems a little scary when you don't know much about it and you can't really articulate what an open adoption might look like, or you're not really convinced yourself enough to be able to encourage it. All of those could be reasons why the staff of the pregnancy centers don't do a more proactive job in recommending adoption.
Do you offer either on a website or somewhere any kind of resources to help people who work at pregnancy care centers to discuss adoption?
Yes, there are a lot of resources on our website, and there are a lot of personal testimonies, because one of the first questions that young women will ask is, but my baby will hate me when he grows up knowing that I placed him for adoption. And that's just not true. If you read the stories of birth mothers as they look back on their adoption decision, that was a concern of theirs often at the beginning. But it turns out that when you read the stories of adopted children, they're not angry with their birth mothers. They're more often grateful that the birth mother chose life and then that she chose good parents. I know that that's the way our daughter felt, that she was grateful for her adoption, and it's not been a huge part of her life in general, like that she thinks about it every day. But when she does, she's content. She's grateful for where things landed. And so there are those myths in the thinking of young women that could be dispelled just with education and information.
Well, so you want to talk about your website then? Does that get into that? What's the address? And we can show it on the screen if you'd like.
Our nonprofit's website is unplannedgood.org.
I'm just going to say some people listen to that on the podcast. So if you're driving, www.unplannedgood.org. Otherwise, if you're watching the video, I'm showing it on the screen right now. So go ahead, take us through.
So a couple of the areas that we've got on the website, we've got a lot of personal stories. There we go. The personal stories are meant to share with people, whether you're looking at this from an adoptive parent standpoint or a birth mother standpoint or an adoptee standpoint. It's a little bit of an insight into how people feel about their adoption later on. And so sharing those stories, especially with young women facing unplanned pregnancy, it helps them to realize that it could all turn out to be very beautiful, and it doesn't have to be nearly as scary as you might think at first glance. And so the stories are really doing the hard work of the website in letting people know what an open adoption looks like these days and why you might want to choose it. And then in the resources section, there's a lot of information about adoption agencies and adoptive parenting and all kinds of different resources there. It goes on and on about what resources might be available to you, as well as some books that are recommended as well.
Terrific. If you're not looking at what I'm clicking through, there are a lot of personal stories. There are a lot of resources listed on this website at unplannedgood.org.
There's kind of a small blog section that's in the about section, and then that'll lead you to the blog. And so there are a couple of, just when I felt very convicted about what to write about, because I didn't have a lot of extra time to be writing a ton of blogs. But one of the first questions that occurred to me when I was writing my first book was I had heard so many times that abortion is bad for women, abortion hurts women. And I really didn't understand that until I did the research for this book. And so that's what part one of that long blog is about, really what happens there, and why you don't hear about that much in our society is probably because of the reasons we cited earlier. But the blog is just sort of an in-depth dive into a couple of key questions that kept me up at night. I don't know about anybody else. But there's that. And then single parenting, the crisis pregnancy centers, their whole goal is to get the woman to raise the child. And often that's setting them up for a lifetime of struggle. And so that's why I do think that adoption is one of the very best solutions for those who have the courage and the strength and the support to go through an adoption placement.
We have our listeners here, right? Many of them are just people who like to say in the pews, and they don't work at a pregnancy care center. Perhaps they don't know anyone who's in a crisis pregnancy. How can they help and get involved in this issue? What can everyone do?
Oh, the fact is that everyone can help. We are all in a position to help. If that 1 in 4 young women get pregnant by the time they're 20, that means that in your community, in your neighborhood, in your church, in your classroom, in your youth group, there are women in there facing unplanned pregnancy. And because of their tender young ages, whether they're in their teens or their 20s, they need an adult to walk beside them and suggest adoption to them, encourage them, and then to be their cheerleader and to say, you can do this. We know you can do this. I'll partner with you every step of the way. I'll look at adoption couples profiles with you. I'll go to the appointments with you. I'll help you get all your questions answered, and we'll do this together. That's how everybody in your audience can help if they just put themselves in a position to advocate for adoption.
So, Terri, why don't you tell us a little bit more then specifically about what your organization has done and whether it's even changed a little bit in its mission from when it was started to now?
Absolutely. So, Bob, we spent the first 15 years of our organization just spreading the word about open adoption and helping to educate people about what that means and what it can look like and why it's a beneficial thing. But then in 2022, when Roe v. Wade was overturned, that was when I hunkered down and actually wrote the first book on adoption. And then that led to speaking engagements, which led to legislative connections. And my board and myself, we started thinking about what we could do to have more impact and realized that so many of these states that are saying no to abortion could actually be saying yes to a solution if they chose to. So that's what brought me to Idaho, actually, was talking to the people in the legislature in Idaho about legislation that would do two things. One is raising awareness about adoption as an option, and that means getting it taught into the health ed classes or the sex ed classes, because they're talking about contraception, they're talking about STDs, but they're not talking about adoption. But now they are. We just got it passed in March that the schools in Idaho will all be talking about adoption when there's any kind of a health ed conversation like that.
Do you know how unique that is to Idaho? I've never even thought about that. Education in the classroom is about adoption. Is
Neither
that
have 48 other
yeah?
states.
Yeah. So they're a standout, and we got to work on 49 others.
Yes. Idaho is the first to get adoption education into the schools, whether they're junior high and high school health ed classes, or even in the colleges where they have medical centers and they're dispensing contraception and testing for STDs. They now also have to provide information about adoption. And so that's raising the awareness about adoption. And I'm thrilled about that. And then the second area of our legislation is in birth mother care, taking care of the birth mothers, ensuring that she gets counseling and that her expenses are covered by the adoption agency, and all different kinds of new bills that are protecting and supporting the birth mothers.
Right. Was that difficult to get the adoption bill passed? If it was difficult, what was the argument against it?
It was not so difficult, maybe just because I was so clueless about the whole policy process. Like, I didn't know what I was doing. I was just counting on God to lead me through, open the next door for me. When it comes down to actually voting to pass these kinds of legislation, most of the legislature sees it as a unifying thing. No matter what side of the aisle they're on, whether they're left or right, conservative or liberal, it's a good situation that you're advocating, because the beauty of open adoption is almost undeniable. And so people see it as a very positive and beneficial outcome of an unplanned pregnancy. Not an easy one, but a beneficial one for sure. And that tend to unify our lawmakers, so that there was very little objection to the three bills that we passed last year.
Are you aware of or working on any other states, or is that kind of outside of the purview of what you have the capacity to do right now?
No, it's not outside the purview at all, because we worked so hard to get these three bills passed last year in Idaho. During the summer, I went to a pro-life lawmakers summit where lawmakers from 40 different states gathered to hear about recent legislation. So I had a keynote speech there where I could explain what Idaho did. And then other pro-life legislators from different states were able to take those same bills, because I passed out templates, model legislation. They take those same bills and they can go introduce them to their own legislatures in the coming session if they want to. And I know that the education bill is getting introduced in January in both California and Oregon. So that's exactly the type of activity we were hoping to see after passing in Idaho.
Great. Oh, your books. You mentioned a couple of books. How do people get a hold
Yes.
of your books?
So the books, the first one is called Pro-Choice, Pro-Adoption. It's Time for a Loving, Positive Response to Unplanned Pregnancy. And that book I wrote in 22, right after Dobbs got overturned. And it's meant for the people who are pro-choice, pro-abortion advocates. It's not a faith-based book. It's a fact-based book, and it explains the downsides of abortion and the beauty of adoption, and it educates people about open adoption. And then the second book is called Pro-Family, Pro-Adoption, A Christian's Guide to Unplanned Pregnancy Options. And that one, a couple years later, is a faith-based book that does give Christians the words and the arguments for advancing adoption when the woman in their community is facing an unplanned pregnancy.
All right. So as you can see on the screen at unplannedgood.org, right from the homepage, you scroll down just a little bit. There's the two books. Check out our adoption book, Pro-Choice, Pro-Adoption, or Pro-Family, Pro-Adoption by Terri Marcroft. Or you can certainly order them directly on Amazon.
On Amazon.
Well, if you prefer
Right.
to do it that way. Right.
But if you wanted to order a bunch of them for your church group or whatever, then it's best to contact me directly, because I can give you a better price and I can sign them if you want.
And you can find your contact on the website as well, I'm sure, right?
Yes.
All right, Terri, if anyone wants to bring you out as a speaker, tell us, how would we do that?
They could just write to me, email me through unplannedgood.org. And I'm happy to speak anywhere I'm invited. This is such my passion in life these days. And so I always say yes to speaking engagements, and then I'm honored to be invited.
All right, terrific. I know there are a lot of pregnancy care centers in our geographical region that are always looking for good speakers, and adoption is certainly a beautiful topic as well. You have a good personal story, and you've been doing this for a long time. So I'm sure you have a lot to talk about. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with us and helping us better understand the beauty of adoption, especially open adoption. And hopefully we can get the word out and better equip the moms that even we know in our lives about the beauty of adoption.
Thank you so much. It was such fun being with you today. Thank you, Bob.
And I want to thank all of our viewers and listeners for tuning in on this episode of our Being Pro-Life series. Head to the website and view all the links talked about in this episode at www.catholicaoc.org/beingprolife. Thank you again for joining us today. I look forward to being with you next time.